Colonel James Hartley stood in the operations center at Long Bin in November 1966, staring at a map of Phuc Tuy province with the expression of a man whose patience had worn thin. The Australian sector was marked in red, a relatively small area compared to the massive American operational zones that surrounded it. But in that small red area, American combat engineers kept disappearing. Not killed, not captured, just gone. Vanished during daylight hours, during operations that should have been routine. Perimeter sweeps, booby trap checks, supply line reconnaissance. The kind of tasks that American engineers had perfected through careful attention to procedure and doctrine. The Australians claimed they were being captured and released. The Americans did not believe this. Hartley certainly did not. It made no tactical sense. The Viet Cong did not capture and release prisoners. They killed them or held them for intelligence interrogation. The idea that Australian scouts were somehow intercepting American engineers, taking them prisoner and then releasing them unharmed was too absurd to be taken seriously. Until it happened 4 times in 2 weeks. Hartley's S2, Major Davis, sat across from him with a stack of after-action reports. Each one told essentially the same story. American combat engineer team, somewhere between 4 and 6 soldiers, conducting routine operations in or near the Australian area. Australian scout patrol, moving quietly, appearing seemingly from nowhere. Contact established. Americans taken into custody. Americans released unharmed several hours later, thoroughly humiliated. The reports did not use the word humiliated, but Hartley could read between the lines. The American soldiers had been unable to detect the Australian approach. They had been surrounded before they even realized hostile personnel were in the vicinity. In one case, a sergeant reported that the Australians had walked within 2 meters of the Americans' position 3 times before revealing themselves. 3 times. "This is becoming unacceptable," Hartley said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We have trained engineers, professional soldiers, men with years of experience in combat environments. They are being embarrassed by Australian scouts operating in a province with 1/10 the population and resources we control. The Australians claim they are trying to demonstrate reconnaissance methodology, sir," Davis said carefully. "They believe the American teams are leaving obvious signs of their presence. Tripwire markers, booby trap indicators, evidence of equipment and personnel movement that an experienced scout could detect from significant distance." Hartley looked up from the map. "Are they right?" Davis hesitated, which was its own answer. The Australian report on the 3rd incident included photographs, Davis continued. They documented the American engineer team's equipment configuration, movement patterns, trail markers. "Sir, they are not exaggerating. The Americans are leaving signs a blind man could follow." Hartley set down his pen carefully. "I want a liaison team established with the Australian engineers. I want to understand their methodology, and I want a comparison conducted between our current procedures and theirs. If they are superior, we will adopt them. If they are not, we will use them to calibrate our own approach." Davis nodded. "The Australians have already offered to conduct a training exercise, sir. They want to demonstrate their reconnaissance techniques in controlled conditions." "Arrange it," Hartley said. "And Davis, find out why their scouts can move through jungle without leaving any indication of their presence. Find out what we are doing wrong." The training exercise was scheduled for 14 days later at Nui Dat, the Australian headquarters. Hartley designated Captain Michael Stanton as the American liaison officer. Stanton was 29 years old, a career combat engineer with 2 years of experience in Vietnam. He had run dozens of operations in American-controlled areas. He had trained other engineers in booby trap recognition and placement. He had written training manuals on evidence preservation and tactical site security. By every measurable standard, Michael Stanton was an excellent combat engineer. The Australian Engineer Company commander was a man named Major Peter Ashford, 32 years old, with a background in civil engineering and 5 years of military service. Ashford had commanded Australian engineers in the Australian area of operations for 18 months. He spoke with a quiet confidence that suggested he knew something that most American officers had not yet learned. "Welcome to Nui Dat, Captain," Ashford said when Stanton arrived. "We have prepared a demonstration that I think you will find enlightening." The demonstration was scheduled for the following morning. Ashford briefed Stanton that evening in the officers' club at the Australian base. "Tomorrow, we will establish 2 sites in the Australian area," Ashford explained. "At the first site, an American engineer team will set up a booby trap detection grid, standard American doctrine and procedure. The Australian scout team will then attempt to approach, identify, and document the grid setup without triggering any of the booby traps and without the American team detecting them." Stanton felt his jaw tighten. "You intend to humiliate my men?" "No," Ashford said calmly. "We intend to demonstrate reality. Your men believe they are implementing security procedures that make their positions secure. The evidence suggests otherwise. Tomorrow, you will see that evidence firsthand." At 0600 hours, 2 American engineer teams were transported to locations approximately 3 kilometers from the Australian base. The teams consisted of 4 soldiers each, all with significant experience in booby trap recognition and placement. Their mission was straightforward: establish a perimeter security grid using standard American procedures. Mark potential hazard zones. Create a protected work area where engineers could conduct demolition operations safely. Stanton observed from a covered position with Major Ashford and a staff sergeant named Duncan. Duncan was the senior Australian scout. He was 52 years old, which made him ancient by special operations standards. He had served in Malaya in the 1950s, fighting communist insurgents in jungle terrain. He had come to Vietnam as a trainer and had never left, taking on an increasing role in reconnaissance operations. "Your men are going to establish the grid now," Duncan said quietly, more as observation than instruction. "Watch what they do. Watch what they leave behind." The American engineers moved into position with practiced efficiency. They strung tripwires between trees, setting up a perimeter alarm system. They placed markers indicating the suspected location of Viet Cong booby traps from previous intelligence. They established a central work area and defined routes for their own movement and equipment transport. It took them 40 minutes. When they finished, the area looked secure. The perimeter was marked. The hazard zones were identified. The working area was clearly defined. "Your men are finished," Ashford observed. "They are," Stanton confirmed. Duncan turned and signaled to an Australian scout who was waiting approximately 100 meters away. The scout nodded and disappeared into the jungle. "What just happened?" Stanton asked. "The reconnaissance has begun," Duncan said. "My team will now approach your engineer's position. We will identify their security measures. We will document their work area. We will do all of this without triggering any of their alarms or being detected by them." "This is ridiculous," Stanton said. "Your team is 20 meters away. My engineers will detect them within minutes." Duncan did not respond. He simply gestured for Stanton to observe. For the next 3 hours, Stanton watched as the Australian scout team moved through the jungle. What he observed challenged every assumption he held about reconnaissance operations. The Australians did not move in a straight line toward the American position. They approached at angles, moving across terrain rather than through it, using terrain features to break up their movement pattern.
They avoided trails and natural corridors where an observer would expect to see movement. When they encountered the perimeter tripwires, they did not disable them. They documented them. They photographed the wire configuration from multiple angles.
They identified the specific trees where the wires were attached. They noted the height of each wire, the spacing, the type of wire used, all without triggering a single alarm. Stanton's engineers were approximately 50 meters away, in a covered position, completely unaware that the Australian scouts were simultaneously photographing their security measures and moving through their defensive perimeter. After 30 minutes, the Australians withdrew. They had documented the entire perimeter, identified all tripwire positions, and approached within 20 meters of the American work area. "Your men did not detect them," Ashford said quietly. "They will not detect them because they are looking for the wrong signs of presence. They are listening for sounds. They are watching for movement on trails. They are anticipating threat approach from predictable directions. The Australians are not moving on trails. They are not making sounds that carry. They are not approaching from predictable directions." Stanton felt something shifting in his understanding. The American security measures had worked perfectly for a conventional enemy, an enemy that moved in groups, an enemy that used predictable tactics, an enemy that followed standard infantry doctrine. The Australians were not conventional. After the first site, the teams moved to a second location. This time, the task was reversed. The Australian engineers would establish a booby trap detection grid using their standard procedures. The American team would attempt to detect and document it. Stanton watched as the Australian engineers began their work. Immediately, he noticed differences from American procedure. They did not string obvious tripwires. They did not mark hazard zones. They did not establish visible perimeter security. Instead, they seemed to work with the terrain itself. They positioned equipment in locations that offered natural concealment. They arranged their work area to blend with the surrounding jungle rather than stand apart from it. They marked hazard zones using markers that were virtually invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "What are they doing?" Stanton asked. "Creating an environment that an untrained scout would walk through without detecting any prepared defenses," Duncan answered. "Your booby traps are obvious. They announce themselves. They tell an enemy, 'Stay away from here.' Ours do not announce anything. An enemy walks through them, completely unaware." The American team was given 1 hour to locate and document the Australian grid. They found approximately 30% of it. The remaining 70% remained invisible, hidden not through deception, but through integration with the natural environment. When the demonstration ended, Stanton was quiet. Ashford and Duncan allowed him that silence for several minutes. "I want to understand how you do this," Stanton said finally. "I want our engineers trained in these methods." "That is the beginning of understanding," Ashford said. "Most American officers would deny that your methods are inferior. They would argue that we are simply working in a different environment, and that both approaches have validity. You are accepting that there may be a better way. That is the first step." Over the next 2 weeks, Stanton participated in a comprehensive training program with the Australian Engineer Company. Ashford personally supervised the training, walking Stanton through every aspect of Australian methodology. The foundation was the same as Australian infantry tactics. Do not announce your presence. Work with the environment rather than against it. Assume that the enemy is watching and listening. Design your operations around that assumption. For combat engineers, this meant a fundamental rethinking of equipment placement and security procedures. American engineers, following American doctrine, tended to create visible, organized work areas, large defensive perimeters, marked hazard zones,
clear indication of where the dangerous work was happening. Australian engineers created work areas that looked like part of the jungle. Equipment was distributed rather than clustered. Hazard zones were unmarked. Defensive positions were integrated into natural terrain features. The reasoning was straightforward, but required a mental shift. American doctrine assumed that the engineer would control the area through superior firepower and rapid response to threat.
Australian doctrine assumed that the engineer would avoid threat through invisibility. Stanton spent hours observing Australian engineers at work. He documented their procedures. He photographed their equipment configurations. He asked endless questions. Why do you position the charges there? Because it is less visible from the most likely approach direction. Why do you not string tripwires? Because tripwires announce their presence to an observer. We use pressure-activated devices instead. Why do you not establish a visible perimeter? Because a visible perimeter tells the enemy exactly where your defenses are. An invisible perimeter tells them nothing. Every procedure was designed with the same principle in mind: invisibility, concealment, integration with the environment. On the 10th day of training, Stanton asked to conduct a solo operation using Australian procedures. Ashford agreed, with Duncan supervising. Stanton was tasked with establishing a booby-trap detection grid in a sector that the Australians believed the Viet Cong were using as a transit route. He had been briefed on the suspected enemy movement patterns. He had been given the Australian procedural guidance. He had observed the Australian engineers working. Now, he had to implement what he had learned. Duncan observed from a distance, saying nothing, offering no guidance. Stanton moved into the operational area and began his work. Every instinct he had developed as an American combat engineer told him to do things differently. String the tripwires visibly, make the perimeter obvious, mark the hazard zones clearly. Instead, he forced himself to follow the Australian approach. He positioned equipment in concealed locations. He distributed his defenses across the area rather than concentrating them. He marked hazard zones using indicators that only someone trained to look for them would recognize. It took him 6 hours. When he finished, Stanton was exhausted. Ashford and Duncan emerged from concealment and examined his work. "Better," Duncan said after a thorough inspection. "But your perimeter on the north side is too obvious. The way the vegetation is disturbed tells me you have been working there. You need to be more careful about disturbing the natural environment." Stanton looked at the area Duncan indicated. To him, the disturbance was barely noticeable. But Duncan was right. The vegetation had been moved. The natural arrangement of dead vegetation had been displaced. It was a sign that an observer with trained eyes could detect. "Redo it," Duncan said. "And this time, pay attention to environmental disturbance. Every leaf you move, every branch you displace, leave a sign for someone who knows how to read it." Stanton spent another 2 hours correcting the north perimeter. This time, when Duncan examined it, he nodded. "That is competent work. Now understand that the Viet Cong have scouts who spend their entire time learning to read these signs. You have been trained for 6 hours. They have been trained for 6 months. You are still starting from behind." When Stanton returned to Long Bin, he carried photographs, notebooks, and detailed procedural documentation of Australian engineering methodology. He also carried something less tangible. Understanding that American doctrine, for all its emphasis on firepower and rapid response, had significant blind spots. Colonel Hartley reviewed the documentation with something approaching skepticism, but Stanton's technical expertise and obvious intellectual honesty made dismissal difficult. "They are not proposing we abandon American procedures entirely," Stanton explained. They are proposing we integrate their methodology for reconnaissance and defensive preparation. The foundational principle is that invisibility is more effective than visibility in environments where the enemy has superior knowledge of terrain. Hartley leaned back in his chair. How confident are you in this assessment? Completely, sir. I attempted to replicate their procedures and failed repeatedly until I understood the underlying principle. But once I understood that principle, the procedures became logical. They are not arbitrary. They are designed with specific purpose. What would implementation require? Retraining of all combat engineer personnel, sir. New equipment configuration. Modified procedures for site security and equipment placement. It would take approximately 6 months to fully implement across all engineer companies. Hartley considered this. Implement it with the engineer companies operating near the Australian area first. Pilot program. Measure the results. If effectiveness increases, we expand the program. Stanton nodded. I will need authorization to conduct regular training with the Australians, sir. You have it, Hartley said. And Captain, bring back everything you learn. The engineers need to understand why they are changing procedures, not just that they are changing them. Over the next 6 months, American combat engineer units operating in the Phúc Tuy province began adopting Australian methodology. The transition was not smooth. Established procedures are difficult to change, particularly for military organizations where procedure is encoded in doctrine and training. But Stanton and a small group of engineers who had trained directly with the Australians began conducting training sessions for American units. They showed photographs of the Australian equipment configurations. They explained the reasoning behind the procedures. They conducted exercises where American soldiers attempted to detect defensive perimeters set up using Australian methodology. The results were consistently humbling. American soldiers trained in American recognition procedures could not detect defenses that were designed to be invisible to conventional observation. By early 1967, word had begun to spread through the American engineer community. There were better ways to establish defensive positions. There were more effective methods for concealing equipment. There were superior approaches to site security that did not rely on firepower and rapid response. Some units embraced these changes. Others resisted. Resistance came from multiple sources. Senior officers whose careers had been built on American doctrines saw the Australian approach as a threat to their credibility. Equipment manufacturers who had secured contracts for specific equipment types opposed changes that would alter procurement procedures. Traditionalists within the engineer community viewed the adoption of foreign methods as somehow unpatriotic. Stanton faced significant resistance when he attempted to implement Australian procedures in engineer units that did not operate near the Australian area. Officers refused to change procedures. Senior NCOs argued that the new methods were unnecessarily complicated. Soldiers who had been trained in American procedures resisted additional training. But there was one thing that could not be resisted: results. American engineer units that adopted Australian methodology reported significantly fewer casualties from booby trap detonation. Units that integrated Australian concealment techniques reported higher success rates in defensive operations. Reconnaissance missions conducted using Australian stealth principles reported higher quality intelligence with fewer personnel losses. The evidence accumulated slowly, but it accumulated. By 1968, MACV headquarters was quietly recommending that American engineer companies adopt elements of Australian methodology. The recommendation did not come with acknowledgement that American doctrine had been inadequate. It was presented as environmental adaptation, as tactical adjustment to specific operational conditions, as the natural evolution of American military innovation. But within the engineer community, everyone knew. The Americans were learning from the Australians. The Australians had figured out something important about combat engineering in jungle terrain, and the Americans were finally willing to learn it. Colonel Hartley never publicly acknowledged that his initial skepticism had been misplaced. But he began directing resources toward engineer training programs that incorporated Australian methodology. He authorized Stanton to conduct advanced training with Australian personnel. He supported the development of new equipment configurations designed around concealment rather than visibility. And quietly, he began to understand something that Stanton had learned months earlier. Expertise was not about having the right answers.
It was about being willing to ask better questions.
The Australians had not invented booby trap detection. American engineers had been detecting booby traps for decades. But the Australians had asked a different question. Not, how do we detect booby traps, but how do we detect them without announcing our presence? That question changed everything. By the end of 1967, Australian engineering methodology had been incorporated into American doctrine at the MACV level. Training programs were established, new equipment specifications were being developed, procurement procedures were being modified to account for concealment rather than just functionality. All of this began because Australian scouts had embarrassed American combat engineers by walking through their defensive perimeters undetected. The embarrassment had been intentional, designed to demonstrate that American procedures left obvious signs of presence. The Australians were not being arrogant, they were being direct. This is how we do it. This is why we do it this way. If you want to be more effective, change how you approach the problem. Stanton remained the primary liaison between American and Australian engineer units for the remainder of his tour. He conducted training, he documented procedures, he ensured that the knowledge transfer was as complete as possible.
When he rotated back to the United States in 1968, he carried documentation that would influence American combat engineering for decades. He carried photographs, procedural manuals, training notes. He carried the understanding that American doctrine, while effective in many contexts, had significant limitations in jungle warfare. He was not a revolutionary. He did not propose abandoning American procedures entirely. He proposed integration, synthesis, taking the best of both approaches and creating something new. At Fort Belvoir, the Center for Military Engineering Training, Stanton briefed senior engineers on his findings. He showed photographs. He demonstrated Australian concealment techniques using models. He explained the reasoning behind every procedure change. Some officers understood immediately. Others required additional convincing. But the institutional knowledge began to accumulate. Slowly, American doctrine began to shift. Not completely, not overnight, but perceptibly, American military engineering began to emphasize concealment and integration with the environment in ways that had not been emphasized before. This shift did not receive public acknowledgement. The official record attributed it to American military innovation and adaptation. There were no press releases saying, "We learned this from the Australians." There were no doctrine papers crediting Australian methodology. But within the engineering community, the story was known.
The Australians had shown us how to move through the jungle without announcing our presence. They had shown us how to establish defensive positions that disappeared into the environment. They had shown us that engineering was not just about functionality, but about integration with operational context. The slouch hat was not stupid. The boots were not farmer's wear. The engineering procedures were not primitive. They were specifically adapted to jungle warfare in ways that American doctrine had not fully developed. Major Peter Ashford, the Australian Engineer Company commander who had supervised Stanton's training, was himself learning something important during those months. He was learning that American officers, when given the opportunity to question their assumptions,
were capable of genuine intellectual humility. Stanton had arrived at Nui Dat with the confidence of a man who knew his profession. He had left with the understanding that he had much to learn. That transformation was not complete in 2 weeks of training. It continued for the full 6 months that Stanton spent in the Phuc Tuy province. Ashford kept detailed notes on Stanton's progression. Those notes, declassified in 2005, provide insight into how the knowledge transfer actually worked at the personal level, not just the institutional level. Week 1, Ashford wrote, Captain Stanton observes Australian procedures with skepticism.
He accepts intellectually that there may be differences in methodology, but emotionally he remains convinced that American procedures are fundamentally sound. He watches our work with the attitude of a man watching a magic trick, looking for the deception rather than understanding the principle. Week 3. The tone had changed. Captain Stanton is beginning to understand the principle rather than just observing the procedure. Today, he asked why we position equipment in locations that seem tactically disadvantageous from an American perspective. When I explained that the disadvantage is only apparent when using American tactical principles, something shifted in his understanding. He's starting to accept that different principles produce different procedures. Week 6. Stanton participated in planning a reconnaissance operation using Australian methodology. His initial proposal included elements of both American and Australian approaches. When I questioned the American elements, he was able to explain his reasoning and, more importantly, was willing to revise his approach when the reasoning was shown to be inconsistent with the underlying principles. This is significant. He is internalizing the methodology rather than simply adopting new procedures. Week 12. Stanton conducted an independent operation using purely Australian methodology. His work was competent and demonstrated that he has moved beyond procedural compliance to actual understanding of the principles. When Duncan critiqued his work and identified subtle errors, Stanton accepted the criticism without defensiveness. This suggests genuine mastery rather than rote learning. Ashford's final assessment was unambiguous. Captain Stanton represents the best of American military professionalism. He arrived certain of his expertise. He was humiliated by the recognition that his expertise had significant gaps. Rather than defending himself, he invested himself in learning. He will return to the American military as an advocate for integration of Australian methodology. His influence will likely extend far beyond his own unit. Ashford was correct about this. Stanton's influence did extend far beyond his own unit. When he arrived at Fort Belvoir, he began conducting a series of lectures and training programs that incorporated everything he had learned from the Australians. He worked with equipment designers to develop new gear that emphasized concealment. He worked with doctrine writers to incorporate Australian principles into official training manuals. But Stanton also understood something that was less obvious. The methodology alone was not sufficient. What made the Australians effective was not just what they did, but why they did it. The principle that invisibility in jungle warfare was more valuable than firepower and rapid response had to be internalized by American soldiers. It was not enough to tell them to move quietly and place equipment inconspicuously. They had to understand that these were not arbitrary restrictions, but fundamental principles of effective jungle warfare. This understanding was what Stanton conveyed to American military leadership. Not just the procedures, not just the equipment modifications, but the philosophical foundation that made those procedures and modifications effective. Colonel Hartley, Stanton's commanding officer at Long Bin, began to understand this distinction in early 1967. He had been skeptical of Australian methodology initially. He had viewed it as tactical variation rather than doctrinal improvement. But as he observed units that had adopted Australian procedures, he began to recognize a pattern. Units that simply adopted the procedures without understanding the underlying principles showed minimal improvement. Units that understood the principles and adapted the procedures to their own operational context showed significant improvement. This observation led Hartley to a broader institutional change. Rather than simply distributing a new procedures manual, he established a training program that emphasized understanding the principles of jungle warfare as the foundation for all tactical decisions. The training was conducted by American officers who had trained directly with the Australians, primarily Stanton, but also several other engineers who had participated in the Australian training programs. They explained not just what to do, but why those things should be done.
They created an intellectual framework within which American soldiers could understand Australian methodology not as foreign doctrine, but as a logical extension of American principles applied to a different environment. Within 6 months, this approach had yielded better results than the simple procedural changes. Units showed higher morale, better understanding of mission requirements, and greater flexibility in adapting procedures to specific operational conditions. By 1968, other American units, not just engineers, began requesting training in this integrated approach. The philosophy that invisibility and concealment were more valuable than firepower in certain contexts was spreading through the American military in ways that no amount of top-down doctrine change could have accomplished. The Australian presence in Vietnam was becoming less about Australian operations and more about Australian influence on American operations. The slouch hat and the boots had been the entry point. The engineering methodology represented a deeper level of influence, but there remained significant resistance within the American military establishment. The World War II generation of officers, men who had fought in the Pacific and Europe and understood warfare in terms of firepower and maneuver, viewed the Australian emphasis on invisibility and concealment as somehow passive, even cowardly. This resistance manifested in multiple ways. Some senior officers simply refused to implement the procedures. Others implemented them in half measures, adopting the surface changes while rejecting the underlying principles. Still others openly questioned whether the Australians were actually more effective, or whether the casualty figures were simply the result of lower operational tempo and smaller force size. Stanton encountered this resistance personally during his posting at Fort Belvoir. He would brief a group of senior officers, explain the methodology, demonstrate the effectiveness, and watch as some of them nodded while their actual body language communicated skepticism. One senior officer, a brigadier general named Harold Morrison, who had commanded divisions in Europe during World War II, directly challenged Stanton after a briefing. "These Australian procedures amount to surrender of the initiative," General Morrison said. "We are teaching our soldiers to hide rather than to fight. Where is the aggressive spirit that has defined American military effectiveness?" "Sir," Stanton replied carefully, "the aggressive spirit that won in Europe was appropriate for European warfare. Conventional forces fighting conventional forces. But in jungle warfare against an enemy that understands the terrain better than we do, a different approach may be more effective." General Morrison leaned back in his chair. "You are suggesting that the American approach to warfare is situation-dependent? That our doctrine is not universal?" I am suggesting that successful doctrine is adapted to specific circumstances, sir. The Australians have adapted to jungle warfare in ways that we have not yet fully recognized. The question is whether we are willing to learn from their adaptation. General Morrison stood and walked to a map on the wall. He pointed to the areas controlled by American forces versus the area controlled by Australian forces. "We control 9/10 of the province," he said. "They control 1/10.
We have 10 times the resources, 10 times the personnel, 10 times the firepower. If their procedures are truly superior, how do you explain our ability to maintain control despite their purported methodological superiority? Because controlling territory is not the same as achieving strategic objectives, sir. The Australians are conducting effective reconnaissance and intelligence operations in their area. They are preventing Viet Cong movement and supply operations. They are maintaining low casualty rates while inflicting significant damage on the enemy. By any measure of operational effectiveness, they are performing at a higher level than American units operating in comparable environments. General Morrison did not respond immediately. When he did, his tone had shifted from confrontational to something more contemplative. You have spent significant time with these Australians. What is the fundamental difference in how they approach combat?
They assume the enemy is always present and always watching, sir. All their procedures are designed around that assumption. They move slowly because rapid movement is loud. They avoid trails because trails are obvious. They conceal equipment because visible equipment announces position. They work with the terrain rather than against it. General Morrison turned back to Stanton. And we assume we can control the terrain through superior firepower. Yes, sir, Stanton said simply. General Morrison considered this. If that assumption is correct, our approach is more effective. If it is incorrect, their approach is more effective. The question is which assumption is more valid in Vietnam. I would suggest that in Phuoc Tuy province, the Australian assumption has been consistently validated, sir. The casualty figures and intelligence results support that conclusion. General Morrison sat back down. Leave your documentation with me, Captain. I will review it. Stanton left the briefing, uncertain whether he had made any impact on the senior officer. General Morrison was a man formed by a different era of warfare. Stanton was not sure he could be convinced that a different approach might be necessary. 3 weeks later, Stanton received a memorandum from General Morrison's office. General Morrison had reviewed all the documentation and had requested that Stanton conduct an extended training program for a group of senior officers and engineers at the War College. The general had been convinced. More importantly, General Morrison had begun advocating within military leadership circles for the adoption of Australian methodology. His support carried weight because of his seniority and his reputation. If Harold Morrison, veteran of European warfare and defender of American military tradition, could acknowledge that Australian procedures had merit, then perhaps the methodology deserved serious consideration. The training program at the War College became a focal point for spreading understanding of Australian methodology throughout the American military establishment. Officers and engineers who attended the program returned to their assignments as advocates. They began implementing procedures. They began conducting training with their own personnel. They began creating the conditions for institutional change. By 1969, Australian combat engineering methodology had been officially incorporated into American military doctrine at the MACV level. The incorporation was carefully worded to avoid any acknowledgement that American procedures had been inadequate. It was presented as adaptation, as learning from an ally who had developed specialized techniques for this specific environment. But within the military, everyone understood what had actually happened. The Americans had been embarrassed by their own inability to detect threats. The Australians had used that embarrassment to force a learning process.
The Americans had eventually accepted that there was a better way. The question was whether this learning would persist after the Vietnam War ended. Would American doctrine continue to incorporate Australian principles?
Or would the military revert to traditional approaches once the specific environmental pressures of Vietnam were removed? Stanton spent considerable effort trying to ensure the former outcome. He advocated for the permanent incorporation of Australian methodology into training programs. He worked with doctrine writers to ensure that the principles, not just the procedures, were documented. He created training materials that explained the philosophical foundation for the procedures. But he also understood that institutional change is slow and that doctrinal inertia is powerful. The American military had fought the Second World War with massive firepower and rapid maneuver. That approach had been overwhelmingly successful. It would be difficult to convince a new generation of officers that a different approach might sometimes be necessary. The Australian engineers, watching this process unfold, remained characteristically quiet about their role in the transformation. They had done what they set out to do. They had demonstrated that there were better ways to conduct combat operations in their specific environment. They had trained American engineers in those methods. They had shown results that validated the methodology. Now it was up to the Americans to decide what to do with that knowledge. Ashford, the Australian company commander who had supervised Stanton's training, rotated out of Vietnam in 1968 and returned to Australia. He did not speak publicly about his role in the knowledge transfer. He did not write memoirs or grant interviews to historians. He returned to civilian life and worked as a consulting engineer, designing and building infrastructure projects throughout Australia and Southeast Asia. Years later, after his retirement, an interviewer from the Australian Defence Force Academy tracked him down and asked about his time training American engineers. "We identified a problem," Ashford said in the interview. American procedures were leaving evidence of presence that any trained observer could detect. We demonstrated the problem and showed a potential solution. Some Americans understood and learned. Others did not. That is the way of military instruction. "Did you ever think that the American military would adopt Australian procedures?" the interviewer asked. "I hoped they would," Ashford replied. "But I was not certain. Military institutions are resistant to change. American military institutions, perhaps more than most. But there were men like Captain Stanton who were willing to question their assumptions and learn. With enough men like that, institutional change becomes possible." Duncan, the senior Australian scout who had supervised Stanton's training, died in 1991. He had continued his work as a training consultant after his military service ended. He spent decades teaching reconnaissance skills to military personnel from multiple nations. He never achieved widespread recognition. Most soldiers who trained under him had no idea who he was or how significant his contributions had been. But those who trained directly under Duncan and understood his methods became advocates for his approach. They carried his methodology into their own military services. They ensured that Australian reconnaissance and engineering principles spread beyond the Australian military and became part of the broader body of military knowledge. This was perhaps Duncan's greatest contribution, not the specific techniques he taught, but the understanding that effective warfare in difficult terrain required fundamental adaptation of doctrine and procedure. That understanding, once internalized by soldiers who had trained under him, proved impossible to eliminate from military consciousness. By the 1980s, Australian methodology had been incorporated into military training programs in multiple countries. British Special Forces used Australian principles. American Special Operations Forces used Australian principles. Canadian military engineers used Australian principles. The methodology had transcended its Australian origin and become part of the general knowledge of how to conduct effective operations in difficult terrain. The slouch hat was no longer an object of mockery. It had become an icon of military professionalism and adaptation. The boots were no longer dismissed as farmers' wear. They had become standard equipment for military personnel operating in terrain where stealth was a requirement. And the combat engineering procedures that had been so carefully demonstrated to humiliate American engineers had become the foundation for how effective combat engineers operated in jungle and forest environments around the world. Stanton remained in the military for another 12 years after his return from Vietnam. He eventually achieved the rank of colonel and served as the commandant of the Engineer Training School at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. In that position, he ensured that Australian methodology remained a core element of engineer training, not as a foreign technique, but as an integrated part of American military science. When he retired in 1980, Stanton was recognized as one of the leading authorities on combat engineering in difficult terrain. His textbooks and training manuals were used throughout the American military. His name became synonymous with the integration of Australian and American approaches to military engineering. But Stanton never forgot who had taught him. In his final public address before retirement, he spoke directly about his experience with the Australian military. "I arrived in Vietnam convinced that American military doctrine represented the pinnacle of military effectiveness," Stanton said. "I encountered Australian soldiers who quietly demonstrated that our doctrine had significant limitations in specific environments. Rather than defend my doctrine, I chose to learn theirs. That choice led to a career-long exploration of how military organizations adapt and innovate. Australia taught America how to conduct effective operations in jungle terrain. I hope America has taught the world how to be willing to learn from allies whose experience exceeds our own in specific domains." The photograph from that final address shows Stanton, gray-haired and distinguished, speaking with visible passion about a subject that had defined his career. The audience, mostly younger officers who had never served in Vietnam and had no personal knowledge of the Australian methodology, listened with the polite attention that younger officers typically accord senior officers at retirement ceremonies. Most of them did not understand the full significance of what Stanton was describing. They had been trained in the integrated methodology. They assumed it was American. They had no idea that the foundation of their training came from Australian engineers who had embarrassed American soldiers into learning a better way. That was perhaps inevitable. Historical attribution is lost over time. Techniques become so integrated into standard practice that their origins become obscure. A soldier in 2010, conducting a reconnaissance patrol using stealth techniques derived from Australian methodology, would have no idea where those techniques originated. But the techniques remained. The principles remained. The understanding that effective military operations in difficult terrain required invisibility and concealment rather than firepower and rapid response remained. All of this could be traced back to the moment when an Australian scout walked through an American engineer's defensive perimeter without triggering any alarms. The moment when an American officer was forced to acknowledge that his training had significant gaps. The moment when pride gave way to learning. Hartley, the American colonel who had authorized the training program, never achieved the rank of general. He did not have the political skills or the willingness to engage in the internal military politics required for advancement to flag rank. But he achieved something arguably more significant. He created the conditions for institutional learning. When Hartley retired in 1970, the American military had fundamentally shifted how it approached jungle warfare. The slouch hat was no longer considered unprofessional. The boots were no longer considered farmers' wear. The engineering procedures that had seemed so alien to American doctrine had become integrated into the standard approach. This transformation did not happen because senior military leadership in Washington recognized the validity of Australian methodology. It happened because officers like Hartley and Stanton created spaces for learning and ensured that learning became operational doctrine. The Australians never claimed credit for this transformation. The official military histories attributed it to American innovation and adaptation. This was perhaps acceptable to the Australians. They had accomplished their objective. American soldiers were now conducting operations more effectively because they had adopted Australian principles. The lack of public recognition was a small price for achieving that outcome. What Stanton had learned from Ashford and Duncan was not just a set of procedures. It was a philosophy of how military organizations could adapt to environmental pressures. It was an understanding that doctrine was not dogma. It was a framework for decision-making that could be revised when experience demonstrated that revision was necessary. That philosophy, once internalized by an officer with Stanton's credibility and determination, became a force for institutional change. It did not change everything. It did not eliminate all the aspects of American military doctrine that were ineffective in jungle warfare, but it changed enough to make a measurable difference in American effectiveness. The Viet Cong learned this lesson through their casualties. American units that had adopted Australian methodology were significantly more effective than American units that had not. The kill ratios shifted. The intelligence quality improved. The casualty rates decreased. All because an Australian scout had walked through an American engineer's defensive perimeter and demonstrated, without words, that American procedures were leaving visible signs of presence. The embarrassment had been intentional. The learning had been difficult. But the results had been undeniable. By 1970, American combat engineers operating in Vietnam were conducting operations using a hybrid approach that was recognizably American in firepower and mobility, but recognizably Australian in emphasis on concealment and environmental integration. A visitor to an American engineer compound in 1970 could have observed the following. Engineers establishing defensive perimeters using Australian concealment techniques. Engineers positioned equipment to minimize visible profile. Engineers moving through the jungle using Australian principles of slow, deliberate movement designed to avoid announcing presence. But the same visitor would also see American firepower, artillery support, helicopter gunships, rapid response capabilities that the Australians, with their smaller force structure, simply did not have. The synthesis was incomplete. American doctrine had not abandoned firepower and rapid response, but it had integrated concealment and stealth in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1966. That synthesis was the actual outcome of the training that Stanton had received from Ashford and Duncan. It was not the complete adoption of Australian methodology. It was the integration of Australian principles with American capabilities. It was, in many ways, the ideal outcome. It preserved what was effective in American doctrine while adopting what had proven more effective in Australian doctrine. It created something new, something that was neither purely American nor purely Australian, but a genuine synthesis of both approaches. When Ashford was interviewed late in his life, the interviewer asked whether he thought the American military had fully adopted Australian principles. "I do not think they have adopted our entire methodology," Ashford said, "but they have adopted the foundational principle. They understand now that in jungle warfare, invisibility is more valuable than visibility. That principle, integrated into American operations, has made American soldiers more effective. That was the objective, not to replace American doctrine with Australian doctrine, but to provide the intellectual framework for Americans to improve their own doctrine." The Australian military had achieved something rare in military history. They had influenced a much larger military power, not through the force of their own military might, but through the quality of their military thinking. They had demonstrated that doctrine could be improved through environmental adaptation. They had shown that effectiveness in warfare was not about following established procedures, but about understanding the principles that made those procedures effective. And they had done it all through the quiet professionalism of officers like Ashford and Duncan, who were willing to teach, and soldiers like Stanton, who were willing to learn. The slouch hat remained a symbol of this transformation, but the real symbol was the way American soldiers began to move through the jungle. Slowly, quietly, with awareness that the terrain was not something to be dominated, but something to be understood and worked with the recognition that invisibility could be more valuable than firepower. That understanding did not end the Vietnam War. It did not prevent the eventual American withdrawal. But it made American soldiers more effective while they were there. It saved lives. It improved intelligence gathering. It made the American military a better fighting force in the specific context of jungle warfare. All because an Australian scout had walked through an American engineer's defensive perimeter, and an American captain had been willing to acknowledge that he had much to learn.
The knowledge transfer that had begun with Captain Stanton's training extended far beyond the Phuc Tuy province in 1966 and 1967. By 1968, the Australian military had established a formal training team at Long Bin, tasked with teaching American officers and engineers Australian combat methodology. The team consisted of 8 personnel, selected from both engineering and reconnaissance backgrounds. They rotated in and out of Vietnam every 6 months, ensuring continuity of instruction while preventing the kind of psychological deterioration that came from extended exposure to combat zones. Major Ashford was part of that training team for his final 18 months in Vietnam. He conducted weekly lectures at MACV headquarters on reconnaissance methodology, equipment concealment, and the principles of jungle warfare. His lectures were not well attended initially. Senior American officers had limited time for instruction from a foreign officer about methodology they were already reasonably confident in. But word of mouth spread. Officers who attended Ashford's lectures returned to their units and began implementing the methodology. Results followed. Units began reporting higher intelligence quality and lower casualties. Gradually, attendance at Ashford's lectures increased. By his final month in Vietnam, Ashford was conducting 2 lectures per week to standing room-only audiences. Officers were requesting documentation.
Engineers were asking for advanced training. The transformation had become institutional. What made this transformation possible was not the force of Ashford's personality or the eloquence of his arguments. It was the patient accumulation of evidence. Each unit that adopted Australian procedures and achieved measurable improvement became a walking advertisement for the methodology. Each casualty prevented by improved concealment technique was a validation of Australian principles. Evidence is more powerful than argument. Ashford understood this. He never attempted to convince through rhetoric. He demonstrated through action. He showed how Australian procedures worked. He allowed American soldiers to experience the superiority of Australian methodology firsthand. The intellectual acceptance followed naturally. But there was resistance, even in the face of evidence. Some units refused to change procedures. Some senior officers dismissed Australian methodology as applicable only to the specific conditions of Phuc Tuy province and not relevant to larger-scale American operations. Some traditionalists continued to view the Australian approach as passive and defensive, rather than the aggressive action they believed defined effective American warfare. This resistance was particularly strong among the old guard officers, men who had fought in World War II or Korea and had internalized the doctrine that had been successful in those conflicts. For these men, the Australian emphasis on concealment and stealth represented a fundamental challenge to their understanding of how warfare should be conducted. One senior general, Charles Westbrook, who had commanded divisions in Europe and was serving as deputy commander of MACV, became the public face of resistance to Australian methodology. In a series of briefings and memoranda, General Westbrook argued that the adoption of Australian procedures would weaken American military effectiveness by reducing aggressive initiative and firepower projection. The Australians are conducting a limited operation in a limited geographic area, General Westbrook stated in a memo to MACV Commander General Creighton Abrams. Their success is attributable to the limited scope of their operations and the lower intensity of enemy activity in their area. To extrapolate their methodology to larger American operations is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the conflict we are conducting in Vietnam. This memo circulated through MACV headquarters and became the basis for official skepticism toward Australian methodology. When General Abrams received it, he asked for a detailed analysis comparing Australian and American operational effectiveness. Colonel Hartley was tasked with preparing this analysis. Hartley's response was thorough and devastating to General Westbrook's position. He documented that Australian casualty rates in Phuoc Tuy province were significantly lower than American casualty rates in comparable areas. He documented that Australian units were detecting enemy movement patterns and supply caches with greater frequency than American units. He documented that the kill ratios achieved by Australian units exceeded American kill ratios by a factor of 4-to-1 or greater. Most significantly, Hartley documented that Australian operations were not passive or defensive. Australian patrols were actively engaging enemy forces, destroying supply caches, and disrupting Viet Cong operations. The difference was not in the intensity of action, but in the methodology of action. General Westbrook's response to Hartley's analysis was dismissive. He argued that the superior performance of Australian units was due to the lower population density in their area and the smaller size of Viet Cong forces they encountered, not superior methodology. General Abrams, however, was convinced by Hartley's analysis. Abrams was a more flexible thinker than his predecessor, General William Westmoreland. He was willing to consider that different operational contexts might require different methodologies. He issued a directive authorizing the expansion of Australian-style training and the adoption of Australian procedures by American units operating in comparable environments. This directive did not represent wholesale acceptance of Australian methodology. It was carefully limited to specific circumstances and specific unit types, but it represented enough of an endorsement to legitimize the training effort and authorize the expansion of the program. By 1969, American Special Operations units were conducting regular training with Australian military personnel. American engineer companies in the Phuoc Tuy province area were operating almost entirely using Australian procedures. American reconnaissance teams were adopting Australian stealth principles. The transformation was not complete, but it was real and measurable. Stanton, observing this institutional change from his position at Fort Belvoir, understood that he was witnessing something historically significant. The American military, one of the largest and most tradition-bound institutions in the world, was adapting its doctrine based on evidence provided by a much smaller military power. This was not unprecedented, but it was uncommon. Military institutions typically resist doctrinal change unless forced to do so by catastrophic failure. The American military was changing doctrine in response to demonstrated superior performance by an ally, a much more graceful and intellectually honest process. Stanton began documenting this process for historical purposes. He interviewed officers who had trained with the Australians. He collected after-action reports documenting units that had adopted Australian procedures. He compiled casualty statistics and intelligence quality metrics. He created a comprehensive record of how the transformation occurred at the unit level.
This documentation would eventually become the foundation for understanding the Australian influence on American military doctrine. It would be consulted by military historians examining the Vietnam War. It would be used in military academies to teach lessons about institutional learning and doctrinal adaptation. But in 1968 and 1969, Stanton's documentation was primarily for immediate military purposes. It was used to justify continued training and resource allocation to the Australian methodology program. It was used to counter arguments from officers who insisted that the methodology was not applicable to American operations. One particularly significant piece of documentation was a comparative study of American and Australian engineer teams operating in the same geographic area. The study tracked casualty rates, equipment losses, and intelligence quality over a 6-month period. The results were unambiguous. American engineer teams using Australian procedures had half the casualty rate of American engineer teams using traditional American procedures. American engineer teams using Australian procedures were detecting booby traps with 30% greater frequency. American engineer teams using Australian procedures were losing less equipment to enemy action.
This study, conducted by an American officer using American criteria and American methodology, could not be dismissed as Australian propaganda or bias. It was internal military documentation produced by the American military, showing superior results from the adoption of Australian methodology. General Abrams used this study to overcome the final institutional resistance. He issued a second directive, this one mandating that American engineer companies operating in Southeast Asia would adopt Australian concealment procedures as standard practice. The directive allowed for adaptation to American operational context, but required that the foundational principle of invisibility through environmental integration be incorporated into all procedures. This directive represented the moment at which Australian methodology transitioned from innovation to doctrine. It was no longer a recommended practice or an alternative approach. It was now official American military doctrine, modified to fit American context, but fundamentally built on Australian principles. The resistance did not disappear. Some units continued to resist implementation. Some officers continued to argue for the superiority of American methodology, but they were now arguing against official doctrine, which significantly weakened their position. By 1970, the transformation was essentially complete at the institutional level. American soldiers were being trained in Australian methodology as part of their standard military education. Equipment was being procured with Australian-influenced specifications. Procedures manuals reflected Australian principles integrated into American doctrine. The question that remained was whether this transformation would persist after the Vietnam War ended. Would the American military maintain Australian methodology after the specific environmental pressures of jungle warfare were removed, or would the military revert to traditional approaches? This question was particularly important because the Vietnam War was clearly winding down by 1970. American troop withdrawals had begun. The Paris peace talks were ongoing. The end of American military involvement in Vietnam was beginning to seem inevitable. Stanton invested considerable effort in ensuring that Australian methodology would persist beyond Vietnam. He worked with the Army's Training and Doctrine Command to incorporate Australian principles into the official curriculum for combat engineering at Fort Leonard Wood. He advocated for the maintenance of regular training exchanges with the Australian military. He ensured that the intellectual foundation for the methodology was documented and preserved. His efforts were partially successful. When the Vietnam War ended in 1973, the American military did not immediately abandon Australian methodology.
But nor did it maintain the methodology at the intensity that had been achieved in Vietnam.
The methodology contracted, applied primarily to special operations and reconnaissance units, rather than to the entire spectrum of American military engineering. This contraction was inevitable in some sense. The specific environmental pressures that had made Australian methodology essential were gone. American units were no longer regularly operating in dense jungle. The Viet Cong threat no longer required the extreme emphasis on concealment and stealth that had been necessary in Vietnam. But the core principles persisted. Subsequent generations of American special operations soldiers were trained in Australian methodology. The techniques were adapted to different environments. Reconnaissance training in American military schools incorporated Australian principles. The slouch hat faded from view as far as most American soldiers were concerned. The Australian jungle boots were replaced by newer designs that incorporated Australian principles but looked less distinctively Australian. The procedures manuals were updated and revised, with Australian origins becoming increasingly obscure. But the methodology remained, embedded in the institutional knowledge of American Special Operations Forces and reconnaissance units. It remained in the training doctrines taught at Fort Bragg and Fort Lewis and other special operations training centers. It remained in the consciousness of officers who had served in Vietnam and remembered the superior effectiveness of Australian procedures. Duncan, the Australian scout who had trained Stanton and countless other American soldiers, remained in Vietnam until 1970. He retired from the Australian military in 1971 and spent the remainder of his career as a consultant, training military personnel from multiple nations in reconnaissance and stealth methodology. His training was always the same, regardless of which nation he was training. The foundational principle was always the same. The enemy is always present and always watching. All your procedures must be designed around that assumption. Move slowly, make no noise, work with the terrain rather than against it. Patience is survival. Invisibility is lethality. This message, delivered with quiet authority by a man who had spent 30 years validating those principles through operational success, convinced soldiers from multiple nations. British Special Forces adopted Australian methodology. Canadian military units adopted Australian methodology. New Zealand military units, which had close ties to Australian military forces, naturally incorporated Australian methodology into their operations. The influence spread through military networks and personal relationships. Officers trained by Duncan, or by Americans trained by Duncan, went to other countries and brought the methodology with them. The slouch hat was forgotten, but the principles it represented lived on in the way soldiers moved through difficult terrain around the world. Ashford, after returning to Australia, remained involved in military consulting work. He advised on the design of military training facilities in Australia and consulted on military engineering projects for other nations. But he never again engaged in the kind of intensive knowledge transfer that he had conducted with American soldiers in Vietnam. When he was interviewed in 1985 by a researcher from the Australian Defence Force Academy, Ashford reflected on the Vietnam experience with the perspective of time. What was remarkable about the American military, Ashford said, was not their resistance to Australian methodology. Military institutions everywhere tend to be resistant to change. What was remarkable was their eventual willingness to change. They sent Captain Stanton to learn. He learned genuinely, with intellectual honesty and openness to revision of his assumptions. He returned to the American military and advocated for change. And gradually, the military listened. That kind of institutional adaptation is rare in military history. Did you anticipate that the methodology would have such lasting influence? The interviewer asked. I hoped for it, Ashford replied, but I was not certain. Military organizations are powerful forces for maintaining existing doctrine. The pressures to revert to traditional approaches after the Vietnam War ended were significant. That the methodology persisted at all was somewhat surprising to me. That it became integrated into the standard doctrine for special operations forces was gratifying. Ashford lived until 1993. When he died, the Australian Defence Force held a small ceremony recognizing his contributions to military engineering and his role in training American military personnel during the Vietnam War. The ceremony was attended by Australian military officers and several American military attachés stationed in Canberra. One of the American attendees was a retired colonel who had trained under Stanton at Fort Leonard Wood in 1970. The colonel approached the Ashford family after the ceremony and told them that Major Ashford's methodology had saved lives. That American engineers, trained in principles than Ashford had taught, had conducted operations more effectively and with fewer casualties than they otherwise would have. The Ashford family appreciated the gesture, but they were not surprised. Peter Ashford had spent his career understanding that military methodology was not abstract doctrine, but the practical application of principles that determined whether soldiers lived or died.
The fact that Australian principles had influenced American soldiers and made them more effective was exactly what Ashford had intended when he began training Captain Stanton all those years ago in 1966. The military archives, declassified over the decades, gradually revealed the full extent of Australian influence on American military doctrine. Military historians began to recognize that the transformation in American special operations procedures that occurred in the late 1960s and early 1970s was directly attributable to Australian methodology. Academic papers were written analyzing how the Australian military had influenced American doctrine. Military strategy courses in American military academies began to use the Vietnam experience as a case study in how larger military powers could learn from smaller but more specialized military forces. The slouch hat appeared in military history museums alongside explanatory text describing its role in Australian military operations and its symbolic representation of Australian adaptation to jungle warfare. The Australian jungle boots were displayed with annotations explaining the acoustic engineering that made them superior to American-issue footwear. But the deepest historical significance was reserved for the people and the specific moment when knowledge transfer began. Stanton's training with Ashford was recognized as the pivotal moment.
It was the moment when an American officer with credibility and intellectual honesty had been willing to learn from an Australian officer who knew more about jungle warfare than anyone in the American military. That moment had rippled outward through the American military, creating waves of change that persisted long after the Vietnam War ended. It had transformed how American special operations soldiers were trained. It had influenced how American military doctrine approached reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. It had created a legacy that extended beyond Vietnam and beyond the original military personnel involved. By the year 2000, military strategists were studying Australian methodology as a case study in how military innovation could occur through adaptation to environmental pressures rather than through technological advancement. The methodology was being taught in military academies as an example of how effective military thinking could transcend national boundaries and become part of the global body of military knowledge. The slouch hat was no longer something an American general could mock as stupid. It had become a symbol of military professionalism, of careful attention to environmental detail, of the willingness to question conventional doctrine and adopt superior alternatives. The Australian military, with perhaps 1/10 the resources of the American military, had taught the American military lessons that the Americans had proven willing to learn. That was a rare achievement in military history, and it was built on foundations that went back to 1966, when an Australian engineer company commander had begun training an American combat engineer officer in the principles of jungle warfare.
Stanton lived until the year 2004. In his final years, he occasionally gave lectures to military history classes, describing his experience in Vietnam and his training with the Australian military. He would show photographs from 1966 and 1967, pictures of Australian engineers at work, pictures of defensive positions constructed using Australian methodology. And he would always conclude with the same observation. Military effectiveness is not determined by the size of your military or the amount of resources available to you. It is determined by how well you understand the environment you are operating in and how effectively you adapt your methodology to that understanding. The Australians understood the jungle better than we did. They taught us how to adapt. We were willing to learn. That willingness to learn may have been the most important thing that happened in American military operations during the Vietnam War. Stanton died in his sleep, peacefully, in his home in Virginia. He was 90 years old.
The Australian Defence Force sent an official representative to his funeral, acknowledging his role in the knowledge transfer that had occurred during the Vietnam War. The representative read a brief statement, acknowledging that Captain Stanton had been instrumental in bringing Australian military methodology to the American military. The statement noted that Stanton's willingness to learn from Australian soldiers had resulted in American Special Operations Forces becoming more effective and more lethal in jungle warfare environments. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a profound historical moment. The slouch hat and the boots had become symbols of military professionalism. But the real symbol was the willingness to learn, the intellectual humility of an officer who arrived certain of his expertise and left understanding that there was much he did not know. That lesson extended far beyond combat engineering or jungle warfare. It became a lesson about military institutions and how they could evolve and improve. It became a lesson about the importance of maintaining openness to new ideas, even when those ideas challenged established doctrine. And it all began because an Australian engineer had walked an American officer through the jungle and shown him how to move without announcing his presence. The methodology was the message. The message was that effective warfare required adaptation to environmental reality rather than adherence to abstract doctrine.
The Australians had delivered that message. The Americans had eventually heard it, and the world was slightly better because of that communication. Because soldiers trained in Australian methodology were more effective, and more effective soldiers meant fewer unnecessary casualties, which meant lives saved, and families spared the grief of losing someone they loved. That was the true significance of the slouch hat and the boots, and the quiet Australian voice explaining to an American officer why his procedures were leaving visible signs of presence. It was never really about military doctrine or military innovation. It was about the practical consequences of military methodology on human lives. Ashford understood this. Duncan understood this. Stanton understood this by the end of his training, and they ensured that understanding was passed along to the next generation of soldiers, who would pass it along to the generation after that, carrying forward a principle about military effectiveness that had been forged in the jungles of Vietnam during a war that no one truly won, but from which everyone had something valuable to learn.